Welcome back to Whence Came You, a Masonic podcast featuring research papers and discussions related to Freemasonry. Here's your host, Brother Robert Johnson.
All right, welcome to the show. This is episode 229, and this week we are talking Star Wars and Freemasonry. And fair warning, we started off on Star Wars and Freemasonry, and we went into kind of pop culture and masonry and all over the board as we usually do. We probably should have a moderator on this show to keep us on task and on subject, but we don't. So I hope you guys enjoy this week's show. This week's show is, again, brought to you by Brothers Blend Coffee, which is produced by Montgomery Lodge in Milford, Massachusetts, and it's roasted by the Red Barn Coffee Roasters in Hopkinton, Mass., and is available at brothersblendcoffee.com, available in 3 strengths, as I would say, Tyler's Cup, Harmony Roast, and Adoniram's Brew. I do not suggest drinking Tyler's Cup right before bed. I did that the other night, and I woke up, man. I was wired. But it's good coffee. I really suggest it. It is a really good coffee. It's not crazy on the acidic side, so if you have stomach issues or reflux, you're fine. What is nice is they're 12-ounce bags, and they're $10.69 per bag. You can check out with PayPal right there on their website, and are not currently able to ship outside the U.S. through PayPal. So for orders outside the United States, shoot them an email at sales@brothersblendcoffee.com, and they'll get right back to you with some shipping information. They do offer discounts on large orders, so if you're a junior warden and you take care of all that coffee, or you're a Masonic caterer, then check it out. This week is also brought to you by Alpha Brain, which you can check out on our Support the Show link on our website, www.wcypodcast.com. And with that, let's get right into this week's conversation with Frater O, Star Wars, and Freemasonry. All right, everybody, we're back with Frater O, and if you followed us on Twitter and you followed Frater O's page, and maybe you heard the announcement on the Masonic Roundtable, tonight we're talking about Star Wars and Freemasonry, probably more along the lines of Star Wars, Jedi, Sith, Esoterics, and we may even touch on some other pop culture references within the construct of the Esoterics. So again, welcome back to the program, Frater O.
It's great to be back. Thank you again. It's great to just talk about topics that we really enjoy.
You know, people that listen to the show often, they'll write and they say, man, you know, you and Frater O really dive into some crazy wild stuff that I've always thought about, and I didn't know if it was a real thing, but you guys kind of validated some of my thinking. And the best compliment that I hear is that when we have these conversations, people think it's like, they feel like they're just at a lodge and they're sitting around and they're talking with their brothers about all kinds of crazy stuff. So I think that's a really big compliment, because they're bringing us into their cars or, you know, wherever they are, and we're all at the same table, which is really cool. So thanks for the compliments, guys. It really does mean a lot. So we've addressed the weird static noise that you guys may have heard in the past in a couple episodes with Frater O, and apparently this only happens on when we record the show, so through Google Hangouts. So we switched up some things, and hopefully we won't have much of that, if not any of it, during this episode. What's funny is Frater O's the only one who can hear it when it happens live, so he'll just have to wave at me and we'll make sure we cut that part out. Without any further ado, Star Wars and Masonry. So obviously a few episodes back, Frater, we had actually mentioned a little bit, and you brought up the Jedi Code. You read the code, and then you said, oh, it comes from the Jedi Code, and you had this book. And so we talked about the Jedi Code a little bit, and it was really interesting because we read it, and we were like, oh, where do you think it's from? And it was the Jedi Code. It had so many similar things with Freemasonry that we said, well, we should just do a show on. So here we are. Frater, I'll let you kind of just jump in. Like, what's some of your initial thoughts? Like, if somebody just said, hey, Star Wars, Freemasonry, or Esoterics and Star Wars, what would you tell them?
Wow, what a loaded question that you just asked. Because I mean, there's this massive canvas where you can start, and the question is, where do you want to start? And just being a philosopher and enjoying the works of Carl Jung, you can see the influences that Carl Jung had on Joseph Campbell, and the hero with 1,000 faces. Are you familiar with Campbell at all? Or
I'm not. Please enlighten.
Okay, so the story behind Joseph Campbell is he has this whole idea of the hero with 1,000 faces, and it's like the same allegory that's been represented throughout history. And it's like comes out of three simple principles, like departure, like the call to adventure, and then the initiation, and then the return. And it's the same thing you can see in a lot of esoteric stories. Even Lucas incorporated into, besides Star Wars, into Indiana Jones. But digressing back, it's like the same principle that you can consistently see through any allegory story.
What about, would you say that was even evident in things of like the 12 Trials of Hercules, and then Jesus, and then Gilgamesh, all of these, what have turned into the greatest religions that man has ever known in modern history? Very similar, fits into that construct, I would suppose, of the hero with a 1,000 faces. So even I've noticed, you kind of brought that up, and I was thinking, okay, Lucas, Star Wars, of course, he did it in Indiana Jones, and he almost did it kind of in a reverse way in a movie called THX 1138, in which his return home was actually breaking out of the underworld, which was really interesting. So some of the similar things that I've read about, say, Star Wars and the esoteric, is we're talking about every character in the movie can be a symbol. The idea is right, so you have Darth Vader is probably emblematical of death. Luke Skywalker is kind of the normal sedentary brain. In the first movie, he's on Tatooine, and he has his aunt and uncle who are like, no, don't go adventuring, and don't do this, don't do that. And then he's all whining about buying some power converters, because that's what Skywalkers do, they whine. But going into that, his aunt and uncle can be likened to the normal things that happen to us in life, I guess, that keep us too grounded and don't allow us. They're the nagging things in the back of your head that maybe say, don't go do this, don't go do that. While Obi-Wan Kenobi might represent this call to light, bringing forth a path, and ultimately coming into this thing called the Force, where they're able to destroy something like the Death Star, which might be emblematical of evil in a sense, and so then good or light destroys the evil. But you'll note there's a symbol, I think, represented in Darth Vader, that he's death, but like in the first film, right, Darth Vader doesn't die because you can't kill death. So there's like this whole weird construct that the movie has if you choose to view it that way. So those are some deeper elemental things I've noticed in the film. But what about the Force and how they try to explain it as a scientific thing, as midichlorians in the prequels?
The Force can be referred to by some systems as consciousness or atoms, or sometimes it's referred to as prana, when you get into Eastern thought, and it's always constantly present, always, and how you can actually influence that. And that's really important, and it's very, very, very real. Your mind, when you keep that in control and when you're building towards something, has a massive effect on it. And if you're able to quiet the mind enough, that's when really magical things happen inside of you. When I say magical, I'm not talking rainbows and unicorns and fairies and cheese. I'm talking about just deep, deep stuff. It's interesting. Empire Strikes Back. Luke goes to system and he meets with this wise sage, right? Which most characters in this hero's journey meets with, and he becomes learning the process of learning the Force and the powerful ideas of that. And that's an esoteric school right there. And the whole time Yoda is teaching him, he's teaching him how to remove the layers and the roadblocks that he's put in front of himself and to start thinking a different way. And then he's been brought up.
Right. So he says things like, clear your mind, you have to empty things. You have to unlearn everything you've ever learned. The idea that you have to clear your mind in order for him to do something. So there's a scene where, Luke is trying to raise the X-Wing fighter out of the swamp, and Yoda says, oh, you can't get your ship out. And I always think that's funny because he's like teasing him, but he's able to do it, and you can see, this kind of strenuous look on Yoda's face. And I would only assume that somebody like Yoda, who is supposed to be this Jedi master who removes himself completely from civilization, and he goes off to live by himself, and it almost looks as he has a harder time trying to do this now that he's not done it maybe in so long, which to me
emphasizing constant practice.
And then let's go another movie forward, but really backward. So in the prequels, young Anakin Skywalker he's the only human who can fly pod racers. And they say you have to have this tremendous intuition to do that, right? Because these things are moving so fast. And we actually talked about on the show about a year and a half ago probably that intuition is actually one of the cardinal virtues in Masonry, which are prudence, justice, temperance, and courage or fortitude. In that episode 1, it's kind of interesting. It alludes to in that idea that Anakin is wise in the ways of the Force already, even though he doesn't know it. He has to have this great intuition to enable him to fly these pod racers that no other human can fly. So some would say, well, that's an allusion to prudence, because prudence is wisdom, an ability to judge things quickly or to know them before they happen, or the ability to play things out in your head and use your deductive reasoning skills to know what's going to happen next. He does that. He has that ability. Somewhat of an interesting depiction of a force, quote-unquote, attribute that can be likened to Freemasonry.
Oh, absolutely. And just to go on more of a scientific-backed explanation, the Noetic Sciences, founded by Dr. Edgar Mitchell, has done amazing tests. They have since the 70s and 80s and 90s. And I think these tests are fairly recent over the past decade. And what they were doing is they were like putting EEG scans on brains and seeing when they would watch a horror movie and they would notice that the brainwaves would already jump before the scary image would appear a few seconds before. So the mind would already know it happened before the eyes would actually see it. It was really, really fascinating.
Yeah, that leads into some really interesting things looking at, they say that we're always living in the past, no matter what. So there is the science behind the sun. It takes 7 minutes from light from the sun to get to us, and then it has to bounce off of surfaces and come to our eyes. So within that, you would ask yourselves, well, if the sun blew up, we wouldn't know for 7 minutes? Or if the sun blew up, then we would instantly be destroyed, but because light hadn't reached us yet, would we have actually been destroyed 7 minutes in the past before right now? So it's this whole idea of reality, and the idea that without a perception of something, does it actually exist? So here's a real scientific example. So if you're like a photographer, I've been a photographer for years, now only hobby, but I used to be paid. I used to shoot on film, and one of the popular things to do back in the day was to shoot infrared film. So infrared film was always really interesting, and people would shoot with infrared all the time, and you could get yourself an infrared flash, so you could go into the movies, and you could like take a picture, and the infrared flash would go off, and the person next to you might not even notice the flash at all. But here you have this perfectly exposed image of somebody watching a movie. But the problem was is that the images were always out of focus. Well, then some camera companies realized that infrared light, in infrared, everything is just a little bit closer to you than it is in the normal spectrum. So what they did was they added a little red hash mark on your focusing lens. And so you would focus, and then you would move it back to the red mark, and now you knew you were in focus in infrared. So if nothing exists but what can be seen or perceived, then how many things that we don't see would be really there? So like if we saw infrared, would somebody in fact, if I reached out to touch them, would I pass through their infrared image and then meet resistance about a half a foot away further? No, probably not. I would assume I would create contact when my hand touched their infrared image. But we don't live in that spectrum. It doesn't happen that way. But it is interesting to note that these noetic ideas, these ideas of the perception of humans and our brain waves and how we react to things, timing, and how our perception ultimately, or seems to, define what is real.
You're absolutely correct. And to dive a little bit deeper, if you look at major events, they play a major impact on the global consciousness in general. The noetic science also have all these random number generators all over the world. And for people that don't know what a random number generator is, it just randomly produces a 1 or a 0 consistently, and just randomly. And before major events, usually 4 hours before, there's these massive spikes of certain numbers consistently on the global scale. They can be buoys in the middle of the ocean, or they can be in downtown metropolitan areas. And they found that, especially before 9/11, they had like a 4 to 6 hour spike before of like something big was going to happen. Usually before big global events, it's consistent. So it gets back to how they have the whole like idea of everyone is one and consciousness is global, and this is more of a hive mind, which is, I'm not going to go into detail, but it's kind of presented in the third degree in that lecture.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, yeah. Talking about that oneness, that would kind of equate to the Force, right? Mm-hmm. So the Force is this all-encompassing thing that lives in people and surrounds people. And what I find kind of interesting also is, Star Wars is supposed to be in a faraway galaxy, but obviously they're much more advanced than we are. They've actually taken that leap of taking something that is what they call the Force, and then in the prequels, they define it as, no, we know what it is. There are these things called midichlorians, and they live in your blood, and they're all around everything, and some people have a strong attraction to them, but they seem to be the basis building block of everything. So if we want to kind of talk about that and make a correlation that perhaps midichlorians could be strings, and in string theory, the thing that all matter is made up of, or you have the ability to manipulate strings, the tiny elements that actually make up all things carbon-based in this universe. Well, I shouldn't say just carbon-based, because I do believe it's probably everything. So there is that parallel there. And then as the movies progress, they kind of go away from that idea, but it's interesting also that in Star Wars, they took that giant leap to say, at some point, we understood the spiritual, and then almost it's lost again, which is interesting in itself, going along with the idea of pre-civilizations, and now, there is the whole idea that man at some point understood who and what we are. We somehow lost that through something they call the fall of man, or God's destruction, or all kinds of interesting ideas.
So I'm going to ask you a question. We kind of went off on the Force, but back to Yoda. I mean, what does Yoda mean to you in the sense of Freemasonry?
It's interesting that you ask, because so when I first started writing Masonic stuff, I was writing for a website called The Midnight Freemasons, which I still write for and am the editor for. And Brother Todd E. Creason, the founder of the website, actually wrote an article called Master Yoda, Freemason or Not, which was a really interesting article. And in it, he says there are levels within the Jedi stuff, so that you have this Grand Master Yoda, right? He's the Grand Master. Oh, we've got something called a Grand Master, right? The idea of, to kind of go, before I talk about the superficial level, which is what kind of this article deals with, but looking at Yoda within the construct of Masonry, to me represents a leader, a master. The idea that he's on this Jedi council, maybe he's on a council of what they would call the invisible superiors. Some kind of interesting force that is constantly in control while having that responsibility to influence things for the better while guarding against the bad stuff. Kind of an undercover thing that he's a part of that ensures humanity's survival. And if you want to say that Yoda then becomes the idea of possible teachings, so Yoda could be emblematical of secret teachings or mystic knowledge that perhaps facilitates the preservation of the human species.
So he's complete Illuminati, what you're saying.
Yoda is complete Illuminati. Illuminati confirmed, Master Yoda. So Creason, in his article, he said, there's all these levels, much like in Freemasonry. There's the younglings, he said Demolay, or perhaps entered apprentices, the Padawan, Fellowcrafts, Master Jedi. Well, duh, that should be obvious. I'll bet there are rings and lapel pins. Jedi Knight, maybe a title for those who have advanced in the York Rite of the future. And Jedi Grandmaster, he said, I'll bet Yoda sits in the East. So his conclusion says, so was Yoda a Freemason? He doesn't know how to tell you this, but you better sit down. Star Wars isn't real. No, Yoda's not a Freemason, but try watching these movies again now and not seeing the similarities. But it is, you got to hand it to Todd, because he started writing about Star Wars and Freemasonry. Well, heck, this was probably, there's a comment here from back of 2012. May 18th, in fact. So that was quite a while ago he wrote about this. And the idea has kind of perpetuated, though, right? I mean, so what is Yoda to you? What would that be for you?
Yeah, Yoda's a very interesting name. And if you study the Kabbalah, sometimes it's referred to the similarity of Yod, or Yod, Y-O-D. Or, you can look at the idea of yoga, the principle of finding yourself, or even the idea or the terminology of a yogi, right? A wise philosopher, in Eastern states. He's the sage. He's like, along any hero's journey, they go along a path, and there's this wise sage that usually shows up on the journey, and they're the ones that impart all these mystical teachings. And it's always about just always showing the door, but that candidate or the initiate or whoever it is has to walk through the door themselves, and some people fail. Some people can't face their demons. It's like when Yoda works with Skywalker, and he sees that dark cave. Luke's like, well, what's in there? He's like, only what you bring with you.
Right.
So all that bad stuff you're holding on to, your demons, you face them.
And so what does he see when he goes in the cave?
Well, I don't want to ruin it for anyone that has not seen Star Wars.
Who hasn't seen Star Wars? If you haven't seen Star Wars, just turn the show off right now, go watch it, and come back. We'll wait. All right, they left. So what was in the cave?
So he finds the dark side of himself, finds that Darth Vader is in there.
Right, which is insane, right? Because it's this idea that the untamed... I mean, and eventually... Now, this is where I don't want to be the spoiler guy for anybody who hasn't seen Force Awakens, but what's really interesting about that whole idea is that you saw the struggle with Anakin Skywalker. And you start to see the struggle at times with Luke Skywalker. And, ultimately, there is this huge struggle that Jedis face with the pull of light and dark forces. And while like the dark side seems to just really be representative of fear and death, in I think it's episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, you have Senator Palpatine is talking to Anakin Skywalker. Anakin's been having these dreams of Padme dying in childbirth, and so Palpatine, in his kind of weird way, is trying to maybe sway him and test the waters, if he might be interested in the dark side. So he says Palpatine, of course, is Emperor Palpatine, or, he's the Dark Sith Lord. And so he starts telling Anakin, hey, have you ever heard the legend of Darth Plagueis? And he says, no, who's Darth Plagueis? He said he was this master of the Sith who could so control the midichlorians that he could even bring people back to life. And, of course, Darth Plagueis was actually Palpatine's master. At a point, Anakin looks over at Senator Palpatine like, big doe eyes, and he says, what happened to him? And he says, well, Darth Plagueis was murdered in his sleep by his apprentice because he taught his apprentice everything he knew. And so he says he was murdered in his sleep. He said it was quite ironic that he died at all, right? And as he's telling the story, Palpatine has kind of this smirk on his face because he knows he's the one who killed Darth Plagueis while he was sleeping. And he kind of tells Anakin, like, hey, I know everything Darth Plagueis did, so if you have control over the Force like I have, you can bring people back. And so, of course, Anakin gets swayed a little bit because, he's got this dream about Padme dying in childbirth. And you can kind of make a parallel there with esoteric teachings in general. What do you want to do with them? Because there is the idea that all of the things that we learn in Masonic lodges, and if you kind of study those things and you get down to their esoteric values, there are great things you can do with esoteric knowledge, and there are horrible things you can do with esoteric knowledge as well. I don't want to go nuts on anything, but there's the idea of there's another mystery school, right, founded by Masons, the Golden Dawn. I've got friends in the Golden Dawn who tell me that one of the things in the Golden Dawn that you study is Enochian magic, and that esoteric kind of stuff. They said that they won't even study it because they think it's way way too dangerous. So there are sides to the esoteric which are viewed as light and dark sides. I mean, of course, there's the base of every Masonic lodge having a checkered floor representative of good and evil, that kind of thing.
If you don't mind, I'm going to kind of sidetrack just a little bit and get
Please.
into Luke Skywalker and the whole idea of Skywalker and just the whole name representing the sun. So if you look at like the Skywalker kind of playing the allegory of Horus, or the Jesus kind of figure, meets Set, which is technically Satan or Darth Vader. You see this consistent allegory of yin and yang, black and white, dark and white, positive and negative, is, Skywalker being the sun, like walking across the sky. I mean, it's very emblematical of just the idea of light. It's really fascinating how that play of that allegory, the polarity is consistently represented. Even the sacred feminine is represented because Luke is a twin.
Right.
He represents the male aspect, but then there's also the whole female aspect as well. So really clever on how that was kind of woven in there as well. How do you feel the character Luke applies itself to Freemasonry?
You brought up the idea of the duality, right? So Luke Skywalker is a twin, essentially representing the masculine, Leia representing the sacred feminine. And within that, going back to Luke, just Luke for a moment, very much the structure of the three movies are absolutely EA, Fellowcraft, and Master Mason. In the first movie, he's an apprentice. I mean, they don't even sugarcoat. I mean, he is. He becomes Obi-Wan's apprentice, kind of. Then he becomes Yoda's apprentice at the end of the movie. It's almost like the culmination of becoming an entered apprentice is represented at the end of Episode 4, the first movie. And then he is an apprentice all throughout the second movie. And then perhaps becoming a Fellowcraft at the end, and within the third degree, or within Return of the Jedi, there is a scene where basically there's a death scene and a confrontation. Perhaps that alludes to Luke becoming a master. Now, am I saying George Lucas said, hey, I know I've read these books on Masonry, I want to turn this into film? No, I think the elements are there. And I think there's a lot of really amazing symbolism that's represented in the films, but the fact that it relates to Masonry is also just the fact that it relates to the esoteric and the kind of hidden mind in general, because Masonry does pull from everywhere. It's interesting that these are within the films. We see this all the time. There is the Matrix trilogy. It's very prevalent there. It's very prevalent in The Force Awakens, too. The newest Star Wars movie, we see a progression there as well. We see a waking up. We see an embracing. We see destruction of distractions. It's very interesting. But to kind of circle back, we talked about, the Matrix a little bit and some things in the past. There are some really interesting pop culture references as well. And we'll come back to Star Wars, but what are some great pop culture references to the craft? And I don't mean like, of course, in the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, both in graphic novel and in the movies, there is Masonic symbolism everywhere, but not necessarily the underlying philosophical theme of the film. That film and those books are really great, but what are some movies or pop culture things where the underlying philosophy or idea of the movie seems to echo esoteric symbolism or Freemasonry?
There's a brother that wrote a really good book. He's written 2 books so far, working on a third. Robert Sullivan. Brother Robert Sullivan wrote some really good books. The most recent one he published was Cinema Symbolism. I've yet to read it, but it seems like it's a magnificent book, and based on reading it on Amazon. And his first book, The Royal Arch of Enoch, is another wonderful read as well. And he has a chapter in particular that touches on just the symbology of movies and the esoteric. And majority of the time, usually it's like the first movie of a sequel series is the most esoteric. And digressing back, you can, that's that hero's journey, or the allegory of the 3 degrees is really emblematic. And also in Indiana Jones, any cult classics, you can look at Back to the Future, Lord of the Rings, you name it, any very iconic film. it's represented. One in particular that stands out that we were talking briefly about in the green room is a movie that came out in 2014, As Above, So Below. It was a horror movie, but man, it is riddled deep in esoterics. It's all about the person in search of the philosopher's stone. So very alchemical.
Yeah, I saw the preview, and I think I shared it on the Whence Came You page when that movie first came out. I was on Trailer Addicts, and I came across the trailer for it, and I watched the trailer, and I thought, oh, wow, what a cool title. And then the trailer kind of left me with a meh, just a horror movie. And so I posted the picture, and people were like, oh, well, hopefully it might be kind of cool or whatever. And I hadn't heard anybody ever talk about it. I think John Ruark had mentioned it once, that he had seen it. I think, John, if it wasn't you, I apologize, and didn't mention too much about it other than saying it was interesting, and talking to Frater O about it before the show, talking about the Philosopher's Stone and the catacombs under Paris and all that kind of stuff. I found really interesting. I think I will end up checking that film out. Some of the other, I think, neat philosophical films that had some deep underlying concepts. Of course, we've talked about Eyes Wide Shut, whole tantric energy within that movie. So another movie is The Never-Ending Story. That movie is so ridiculously esoteric. In fact, I think Frater O and I were going to have a guy on who wrote a great paper about it, and he was, at the point, really interesting individual when he wrote the paper. He has since, when I approached him about doing the show, he said he would love to do the show and talk about the paper. However, he is currently, he says he has to let us know that he's an atheist, and he no longer sees the film the same way as he once did. And not that I didn't have him on because of that, it's just things haven't lined up to have him on yet. But it is interesting. That movie, so amazing. You know, there's scenes where the main character has to run between two statues, and there's a whole series of rules that he has to utilize in his mind in order to get through it. The idea of a whole creation of a new world with the uttering of a name. Just really intense things in that movie. That's probably one of my favorites. There was another movie released not too long ago, maybe 2 years ago, visually absolutely stunning. Sounds were amazing, and I cannot remember the name of it, so if I remember, I'll put it in the show notes, but it's primarily about a drug trip, really, but it's pretty intense.
There's so many amazing films that always has this allegory represented into it. The one in particular, it doesn't really apply to Masonry so much, but it's definitely esoteric. It's called About Time, and it came out fairly recently. It's kind of a drama. It's this one character who has the ability. All the males in this family can travel through time.
Interesting.
Spoiler alert for those who have not seen it yet. This person can go back in time and change time, but then he realizes. He goes back after time. He realizes he just can't change everything. It just becomes out of control. That he goes back and relives every single day and lives it the best he could possibly live and fixes it. Then ultimately he realizes that every day he just wakes up, he lives in the now. He realizes he can't change the future and he can't change the past. He just lives every single day the best that he possibly can. And it's a super deep and powerful movie.
Yeah, those kind of movies are so interesting because they take you through a range of emotions. Realizing all of the things you may have done in the past and knowing of the playing on your fears of the uncertainty of the future, but ultimately bringing you back home centered and leave you with a feeling of knowing that it's okay to live right now. We have a saying in some Masonic bodies that the hour is now. You know, the hour is always right now. In fact, Frater, you said something last week, a quote, and if you wouldn't mind just repeating it, it was about the past and the future as an anxiety.
It's written from the I Ching by Lao Tzu. He who lives in the past suffers from depression. He who lives in the future suffers from anxiety, but the power is living in the now. That's paraphrased, of course.
Right, and the power really is living in the now, right? Because this is when we're using action to make things happen that you want.
But isn't life just good ritual, like living ritual to the T?
You know, it can be. You can describe it that way for sure. The ritual, regardless of what your ritual is, we all have one and we all live it. and perfecting ritual has that allegorical sense. What we do in the lodge has an exact interpretation outside of the lodge, right? So like Solomon's temple is the human body. To perfect your ritual in the lodge is to perfect your ritual outside of the lodge. And people who miss that are missing a whole lot. The ritual in lodge isn't perfect. It doesn't mean that your ritual outside of lodge isn't perfect. But your dedication to one is hopefully putting a reminder in your brain subconsciously to perfect the ritual outside as well.
Well, embodying that simple idea. There's a scene in The Matrix that I love so much, and it's Neo saves Morpheus, and they just got out of the helicopter, and they're on the rooftop, and Morpheus looks at Neo and asks him, sooner or later you'll realize, just as I did, there's a difference between knowing the path and walking the path. And that's a very powerful line, because we can sit here all day and talk about what we need to do, or think about what we need to do, and read about what we need to do, or just go do it.
Yeah, and I tell people all the time, the real secret to doing so much stuff is really that Nike has been telling us to do for years, which is to just do it. We have such a issue today with people talking and never doing. You see it in politics. You see it in Masonic lodges. People who consistently make plans to do something, to make something happen, yet it never comes to fruition. And in order to do something, to get it done, we talked a little bit about this last week on Masonic Roundtable. We talked about hope as an action. And we talked about the laws of attraction. And you'll find that people who make it happen, people who just do it, are folks who consistently visualize the future, consistently talk about the future, and consistently go forward and beyond what is necessary to plan for something. You make vision boards. You create a diary of your hopes and your dreams, and you make it happen because you're holding yourself accountable subconsciously. That's all.
That's some powerful stuff, man.
I know we said we'd come back to Star Wars, and we kind of went off on some tangents, and I hope we touched on enough Star Wars. I mean, we probably didn't. There are 7 films, and we only touched briefly on, I think, I don't know, I guess we hit them all. There's so much more that I think we could talk about, and if you guys listening to the show would do us a favor and send us an email, drop a line on Frater O's Facebook page, drop a line on the Whence Facebook page, whichever, hit us up on Twitter, find out some interesting things within that world of Star Wars or any other pop culture movie, and that you might find there is an esoteric connection to, and let's discuss together, and hopefully we'll get a bunch of responses on this, and we'll have a bunch of cool points to go over in the future, and we'll make an episode out of it. It'll be kind of a Frater O and RJ discuss your great ideas as they relate to esoterics and pop culture stuff. So whether it's music or movies or comic books. Comic books always are a little bit more wild in terms of esoteric because they're not as widely read. So when something gets put into music or a film, it's a much more large deal because so many people are seeing it, and most people will see the movie, but not everybody will really see the movie. So drop us a line, let us know what you think, and we'd love to discuss more of your thoughts and ideas on the program. So with that, I just want to say, Frater O, thanks so much for coming on. Can't thank you enough for your great insights and the knowledge you bring to me and our listeners.
Oh, well, thank you very much, and it's always great to be back on the show, and it was a great discussion. But digress back, the power is now in just applying that ritual to your life.
Absolutely. Just before we go, I do want to mention that Frater O and myself will most likely be on the Cult of Personality podcast sometime in the next couple months with Greg Kaminsky, who's also a brother. We had him on the show not too long ago. So look for that, and we'll make sure we update you guys when that's going to be, and hopefully you'll listen in. It should be a great time. Greg Kaminsky is fantastic and mind-blowing every time. All right, I hope you enjoyed the conversation. We did go a little bit off topic when we hit some other pop culture references talking about other movies. One movie that I wish we had remembered to talk about was the movie The Ninth Gate. One of my favorites. So again, please head on over to Frater O's Facebook page, give him a like, and check out his updates from time to time. Now, he doesn't live on social media like I do or some of us do, so do be patient with some of his updates. But likewise, please follow us on Facebook and Twitter as well. If you have any questions, then you can certainly email Frater O at fraterolux@gmail.com or at fratero@wcypodcast.com. Either one, he'll get those emails. We'll carry on some great esoteric conversations with you, or if you just want to say hi and thanks for the conversation, I'm sure he will enjoy. So as we spoke about earlier in the show, we talked about the sponsors of the program. So of course, again, brothersblendcoffee.com, huge supporter of the program. Really can't thank them enough for what they've done for us. In addition, I did mention that we are sponsored in part by Onnit Labs and Alpha Brain. So Alpha Brain, right now, this month only, in February, you can actually get Alpha Brain Instant for 10% off, and they are hooking up this show with an additional kickback to help keep the lights on. So if you head on over to www.wcypodcast.com and you click on support the show, and then you click on the link for Alpha Brain or the link for Alpha Brain Instant, you can really help out the show because the price doesn't change on their website, but when you go through us, you're going to get a discount of 10% when you use the promo code WCY. But you got to do those two things. You have to click through our link and use that promo code WCY. And when you do that, you're going to get that 10% off, which totally takes care of shipping and a little bit more usually. And they'll take a little cut on their end, and they'll send us a little something to help keep the lights on. Again, Alpha Brain is awesome. I use it almost every day, especially sometimes I take it midday and I sleep really well and I have some nice lucid dreaming and I wake up instantly. I don't have any grogginess in the morning. Now, that's not going to happen for everybody, but I've certainly found it to be a benefit and an enhancement. So please do check that out. Also, of course, you can visit our limited edition shop and check out the lapel pins and the money clips and tie bars and things of that nature. I think we only have one tie bar left now and just a couple sets of cufflinks left. So please check those out. The pins are $10. The tie bars are $10. The money clip is $10, and the cufflinks are $15 because it is 2 pieces. So please check those out, and I hope you enjoy them. And of course, the last but not least way to help us out is, of course, a direct PayPal donation. Some people like to donate $5 a month. You can set that up recurring, or you can donate 50 cents one time. It doesn't really matter to me, but just know that everybody who contributes to this program is the reason the program is on. So it is listener-supported Masonic education, and that's what we strive for, that's what we aim for. And if you meet somebody who listens to this show and he has a lapel pin on, thank that person, because that person is a producer of the program and makes this show available all the time. We don't have a backlog of episodes that's available to premium subscribers. Some shows do that, and that's okay. We just don't do that here. So episode 1 all the way to 229, this episode is available for you anytime, all the time. You can download the shows, you can re-upload them on your lodge websites, you can do anything you want. You can shoot me an email or a message on Facebook and say, hey, can we get an HTML5 code for our website to play the show on our lodge website? Absolutely, no problem. What we do with this show is this show belongs to Masons and Masonry. I'm not going to do this show forever. This show will live on, but I will inevitably turn this show over to another brother who is a podcaster, and they will take over. Again, this show belongs to Freemasonry and all the brothers in it, and so I really appreciate everybody who supports the show because it's helping all of us. So with that, we're going to go right into this week's Famous Freemason. All right, this week's famous Freemason is James Harold, or Jimmy Doolittle, born December 14th, 1896, and he passed away on September 27th, 1993. Long life. Well, he was an American aviation pioneer, a reserve officer in the United States Army Air Corps. Doolittle was recalled to active duty during World War II and was awarded the Medal of Honor for his valor and leadership as commander of the Doolittle Raid. He was eventually promoted to lieutenant general and commanded the 8th Air Force in Europe. So he was involved in tons of conflicts. During World War I, he stayed in the United States as a flight instructor and performed his war service at Camp John Dick Aviation Concentration Center, or Camp Dick, and it was at Texas Wright Field in Ohio. And again, he went into World War II as well. Doolittle was one of the most famous pilots during the interwar period. In September of 1922, he made the first of many pioneering flights flying the de Havilland DH-4, which was equipped with early navigational instruments. In the first cross-country flight from Pablo Beach, renamed Jacksonville Beach, Florida, to Rockwell Field, San Diego, in 21 hours and 19 minutes, making only one refueling stop at Kelly Field. The U.S. Army awarded him the Distinguished Flying Cross. So, while stationed in Louisiana during World War I, preparing to go overseas, Major General James H. Doolittle, under special dispensation issued by the Grand Lodge of both California and Louisiana, was elected to membership in Hollenbeck Lodge number 319 of California and initiated, passed, and raised in one meeting in Lake Charles Lodge number 16 of Louisiana. A recent storm had wrecked the Lake Charles Masonic Temple, and the degrees were conferred in the local Elks Temple, loaned out for the purpose. Doolittle in life had married his wife Josephine Daniels on December 24, 1917. At a dinner celebration after Jimmy Doolittle's first all-instrument flight in 1929, Josephine Doolittle asked her guests to sign her white damask tablecloth. Later, she embroidered the names in black. She continued this tradition, collecting hundreds of signatures from the aviation world. The tablecloth was donated to the Smithsonian Institute. They were married for over 70 years, and Josephine Doolittle died in 1988, 5 years before her husband. The Doolittles had two sons, James and John. Both became military officers and pilots. James Jr. was a pilot for the U.S. Army Air Force during World War II, and later a fighter pilot in the U.S. Air Force in the late 1940s through the late 1950s. Unfortunately, he had committed suicide at the age of 38 in 1958. At the time of his death, James Jr. was a major and commander of the 524th Fighter Bomber Squadron, piloting the F-101 Voodoo. His other son, John P. Doolittle, retired from the Air Force as a colonel, and his grandson, Colonel James H. Doolittle III, was the vice commander of the Air Force Flight Test Center at Edwards Air Force Base in California. James H. Jimmy Doolittle died at the age of 96 in Pebble Beach, California on September 27th, 1923, and he's buried at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia, near Washington, D.C., next to his wife. In his honor, at the funeral, there was also a flyover of Miss Mitchell, a lone B-25, and United States Air Force 8th Air Force bombers from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. After a brief graveside service, fellow Doolittle Raider Bill Bauer began the final tribute on the bugle. When emotion took over, Doolittle's great-grandson Paul Dean Crane, Jr. played taps. So what an amazing service to the country. Veterans around the country, Masonic and non-Masonic, are just the real heroes of today. And support your veterans, guys. Near and dear to all of us. With that, we're going to close out the show this week. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you really enjoyed it. Please remember to find us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Whence. If you care to, you can follow my non-Masonic rantings on Twitter at RJ the Speaker. Please don't forget about the Midnight Freemasons, publishing 3 articles every week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Don't forget about the Masonic Roundtable. We go live every week at 10/9 Central, and we talk on YouTube, live panel discussion about various Masonic topics. This upcoming week is going to be all about charity. It'll be a great show because we're probably not going to mention the kind of charity you're thinking about, so I hope you tune in. Now, I do have an official visit this Tuesday, so I may be late to the program, but I'm still planning on being there, so I hope you do too. Remember to submit all your questions for the episode live during the show, because we do go over the social media and everything that people will post. We read on the show, and we try to answer those questions right there, live, for you guys. And for everybody and for us too, as it's a giant learning experience. Again, please check out our sponsors. So again, thank you so much, and I'll see you all at Masonic Week. Until then, stay on the level. For Whence Came You, I'm Robert Johnson.
You've been listening to Whence Came You, a Masonic podcast featuring research papers and discussions related to Freemasonry with your host, Brother Robert Johnson. Be sure to join us for our next edition.